I was supposed to marry the love of my life, except days before the wedding, I found out she'd secretly invited my abusive parents. The same parents I cut all contact with at 18 and hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Her plan? A surprise gift she thought would warm my heart. What it actually did was guarantee I wouldn't show up at all. And yes, it's every bit as unbelievable as it sounds. To understand how we even got here, you have to know why the guest list wasn't just a detail. It was the only rule that couldn't be crossed. Why the guest list was the hill I was willing to die on. When we first sat down to make the guest list, I figured this would be one of the simpler parts of wedding planning. Just a list of names. Easy enough. But the moment it turned to my side of the family, the whole thing stopped feeling casual. It wasn't a matter of cutting it close on seating charts or debating plus. Once for me, there was one clear, unshakable condition. I've been no contact with my parents since the day I left home at 18. That was over a decade ago, and they haven't been part of anything in my life since. Not birthdays, not graduations, not even the smallest personal milestone. That wasn't neglect on their part, it was choice on mine. The decision came after years of damage I couldn't repair and wouldn't risk repeating. Keeping them out of my life wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about staying safe and sane. So early in the planning, before we talked flowers or food, I told my fiancé they would not be invited. Period. She looked surprised at first, like it hadn't occurred to her that parents might not automatically be on the list, but when I explained why, she said she understood. She explicitly told me she supported my decision. Her agreement felt sincere, and from that point on, I believed the matter was closed. Other people didn't always get it. Friends would throw out comments about mom crying during the vows or dad giving the toast, and each time I simply said, "They're not coming." Sometimes people would ask why, sometimes they'd just change the subject, but I was consistent. I didn't soften it, I didn't leave open ends. The more I repeated it, the more I thought the boundary was secure. To me, this wasn't a preference, it was non-negotiable. There was nothing to revisit later, no test run to see if things might be different. I'd made that clear. And because she'd assured me she accepted it, I assumed we were on the same page. What I didn't realize was that in her mind, the conversation we'd had wasn't the end. She had set it aside like a challenge to be revisited, an obstacle that could be turned into some kind of emotional gift. While I moved ahead, picturing a ceremony without the shadow of old wounds, she was quietly imagining something else entirely. I thought it was resolved. I was wrong. The sweet surprise that was actually a landmine. A few days before the wedding, I walked into the living room expecting nothing more dramatic than finding my fiancée and her maid of honor finalizing seating charts. Instead, I caught the tail end of a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Her friend leaned over the wedding binder and asked, "Are you sure he's going to be okay with, you know who's showing up?" Does he know yet? You know who. It landed in my ears like some strange code word I couldn't place until she answered. She looked up with a small smile and said, "It's a surprise. Once he sees them, it'll be fine. I think it'll make him happy on our big day. Trust me." The friend froze mid-page turn. The air in the room shifted instantly, like someone had flicked a switch. She grabbed her bag without meeting my eyes and mumbled something about having to run. A moment later, I was alone in the room with my fiancé, shoes still in my hand, sure of one thing, I hadn't misheard. I asked, as evenly as I could, "What surprise are we talking about?" She hesitated for a beat, then said it outright she'd invited my parents. The same people I'd cut out of my life completely at 18. She said it like she was handing me front row tickets to a dream concert, waiting for my face to light up. Except these weren't musicians I loved. They were the last two people I wanted anywhere near me, especially on my wedding day. In her mind, though, this wasn't a violation. It was a grand gesture. She explained that she'd pictured the moment in detail, me at the altar, turning to see them beaming with pride and some emotional floodgate opening. She talked like this one visual would undo over a decade of deliberate distance. The way she spoke, it was as if she believed trauma could be wiped clean by a single Hallmark-style reveal. I asked her why she thought inviting them, without telling me, was a good idea. She didn't fumble for words or apologize. She told me it was her gift to me. That's the word she used, gift. as though my boundaries were wrapping paper and my history was a bow she could untie. She genuinely believed that on our wedding day, it would feel like the missing element I never knew I needed. Listening to her, it became clear this wasn't just a misunderstanding. She hadn't forgotten our conversations. She had reinterpreted them into something she could fix for me. Everything she said was in the future tense. You'll see, you're going to like it, you'll thank me later. This wasn't a plan in progress. It was complete. The invitations had already been sent. Worse, my parents had accepted. They knew when and where the wedding was happening. They were planning to show up. I reminded her, carefully but firmly, that no contact wasn't a whim I might outgrow. It wasn't about a single fight or awkward holiday. It was the result of years of relentless harm. I told her things about my childhood that had made her shake her head in disbelief. She couldn't claim not to understand the stakes. And still, here we were, on the edge of the one event I'd allowed myself to believe could be joyful, and she had built it around a scenario I had spent years protecting myself from. What struck me harder than the plan itself was her posture about it. There was no recognition that this could be the wrong move for me. No, I see why you're upset. Just the unwavering idea that she was right, and I'd change my mind once it happened. She framed it as certainty, like she had knowledge of my own feelings that I somehow lacked. That's when the urgency hit me. This wasn't something we could just remove from the program the way you replace a centerpiece. They were already invited, already coming, and if nothing changed, already guaranteed to walk into the most vulnerable moment of my adult life. It was in motion, and she didn't want to stop it. I told her plainly it wasn't going to go the way she imagined. But if they appeared at the ceremony, I would not. I wasn't shouting. My voice was steady, maybe even calmer than she expected, but I wanted her to hear me clearly. The wedding could still happen, but not with them there. That was the sole condition. She looked at me like I was threatening to sabotage the best day of our lives over a detail, as if safety and mental health were interchangeable with decor choices. I didn't argue further in that moment because I realized argument wouldn't change her mind. She believed this was the right thing to do. What I knew, without needing her agreement, was that if my parents walked into that venue, I wouldn't be there to see it. My boundary had been clear from the start, and she had bulldozed it. That clarity made the next part inevitable. The conversation was over, but a much bigger conflict was waiting. And in the quiet that followed, I started to understand just how far apart our definitions of love, trust, and protection really were. I didn't yet know all the ways she'd justify it in her head, but I was about to find out. Her logic, because every Netflix reunion ends well. Her explanation landed with a kind of surreal logic you usually only hear in those straight-to-streaming, heartwarming dramas. You know the ones. Low-budget, vaguely familiar actors, a paper-thin plot about people coming together against all odds. Except in her mental version, it wasn't a quirky romance. It was more like Hallmark Presents, instant forgiveness, starring two people I'd spent over a decade avoiding for reasons she already knew in detail. She spoke in full scenes, like she was pitching an episode. Picture it, you're at the altar, I'm walking toward you, the music swells, and then you look out and see your parents. They're smiling. They're proud. Everything melts away in that moment. That phrase stuck, melts away. As if the abuse, the manipulation, the constant undercurrent of fear I grew up with were just snow on a sunny day, gone instantly with the right dramatic backdrop. No acknowledgement of harm, no difficult conversations, no repair, just a visual gimmick engineered for an emotional high. She knew my history. I'd told her enough for her to sit there stunned at times, patterns of cruelty and control I could never misinterpret as love. But in her worldview, that could all be rewritten by the right surprise. It sounded less like a thoughtful act and more like she'd been binging reunion clips on social media, long-lost relatives hugging in slow motion, tears glinting under perfect lighting, swelling music masking the complexity underneath. In reality, those moments are heavily edited. The heavy, ugly parts never make it to the screen, but those edits were the only version she seemed interested in. She even spoke about capturing that moment like it was a photo op worth building into the day, getting almost giddy at the thought of it becoming the centerpiece of our wedding album. There was no pause to consider that I might not want that moment photographed at all, let alone created without my consent. The sequence playing in her mind was simple. They arrive, I tear up. They tear up, we hug, all past. Wrongs are forgotten, applause rolls in, and everyone toasts to new beginnings. It was a plot where my trauma existed only to set up a reveal, a heartstring, yanking B story that would make the real story more moving. The confidence behind it was jarring. She wasn't tentative, wasn't wary that this might go badly. If anything, she seemed baffled I wasn't smiling at the brilliance of it. She leaned into the idea like she'd stumbled on the perfect viral wedding moment, something strangers would call so sweet in relationship goals. My lack of excitement registered to her as if someone had turned down a free puppy. I reminded her, again, that there wasn't some hidden softness toward my parents waiting to be coaxed out. They weren't safely neutral figures we'd simply lost touch with. They were people whose presence in my life had been actively dangerous to my well-being, and who had been cut out because contact meant harm. Putting them in formal clothes in a nice venue didn't rewrite that equation. Her response, a slow nod, at first seemed like she might finally be considering it. Then I caught the rhythm of it, the nod of someone who's already decided what the ending will be and is simply humoring you until it happens. It became clear her certainty didn't come from knowing my reality, but from believing in a narrative. In every movie she'd ever absorbed, estranged family members turn out to be misunderstood, reconciliations take hold instantly, and no one leaves wishing they'd stayed away. She treated my boundary not as a safeguard I'd fought for, but as a storyline she was convinced could only resolve in a big, cathartic reconciliation. And the truth is, part of this wasn't naive, it was willful. She'd heard the broad strokes of what my parents had done. She'd been in the room when I had told her stories that left her shaking her head. But somehow she'd filed that knowledge into a distant category, complicated relationship instead of abusive relationship. Otherwise, this plan could never have made sense, not even to her. The more she explained it, the more it tilted from misjudged to alarming. She said she didn't want me to wake up one day wishing I'd done things differently, that she was thinking about my future self who would supposedly thank her for intervening. In her mind, she was protecting me from regrets. In reality, she was actively creating the exact kind of moment I had worked to avoid for years. This wasn't a harmless misunderstanding. This was someone taking the clearest, most important boundary I have and treating it like a puzzle to solve. She framed my no contact as an obstacle that love and her boldness could dismantle. That's a very different mindset than I respect you enough to honor what you told me. And if she could override the biggest line I'd ever drawn, one I'd held for more than a decade, I had no reason to think she'd respect any smaller lines. That wasn't just about one wedding. It was about the shape a life with her would take and who would actually be in control of my story. The absurdity of her reasoning almost made me want to laugh, but the stakes kept it firmly in focus. This was about people who had caused real, lasting harm, people I described to her in detail that left no room for misunderstood. She knew, and still she trusted a fantasy sequence more than she trusted me. That realization didn't make me angry in a loud, explosive way. It was more like the sound of a lock clicking into place. Once you see that someone will trade your safety for their ideal ending, all future trust starts to corrode. And the wedding glow we were supposed to be in? It had already gone cold. I needed her to see this for what it was, not what she imagined. Which meant sitting her down and stripping all the romantic framing away until the truth stood alone. I still thought maybe if I said it plainly enough, she'd understand what she was really doing. Negotiating with a brick wall decorated in tulle. I went straight into it. No warm-up, no lead-in. I looked at her and said, if they show up, I won't. I wanted that to be the first thing out of my mouth because there was no point in easing into the subject. It was a boundary and a consequence, clear enough that there couldn't be a misunderstanding later. Then I spelled it out, calmly, but without any soft edges. This isn't some quirky family spat you patch up on a whim. It's years of deliberate harm. You've heard the specifics. You've heard me tell you stories that made you stop talking mid-sentence because you couldn't believe anyone would do that to their kid. You told me yourself those things were awful. And now you've invited the people responsible into the middle of the one day that's supposed to feel safe for me. Her reaction didn't match the weight of what I was saying. She held my gaze, but it was polite and distant, like she was waiting for me to wrap up. When I stopped, she smiled faintly and said, "One day you'll thank me." It was delivered so matter-of-factly, as if she was pointing out tomorrow's weather forecast. And the only possible version of the future was the one where I saw her as the hero in the story. I reiterated, flat, "I will never thank you for this." Nothing in my tone wavered. It wasn't anger boiling over, it was a decision spoken aloud. I told her this wasn't about a lapse in taste or misreading my mood. This was about her taking one of the most personal choices I've ever made and erasing it because she preferred her version of the ending. She kept returning to the same two lines, "It's for the best and you'll understand when it happens." Each time, she said it like she was so certain my stance was temporary. I countered with reality. No contact for over a decade. No apologies from them. No change. No neutral ground. Just the same people, the same harm, given front row seats. When I repeated that I would not stand at the altar with them in the room, I slowed it down, half for emphasis, half to watch if the seriousness registered. For a flicker of a second, I thought it had, but then she gave this small, almost amused laugh and said, "You're not serious." I told her I was absolutely serious. "If you remember nothing else, remember that," I said. "I'd rather not get married at all than stand there pretending things are fine with them in the audience." I made sure my voice stayed even. There wasn't a raised pitch or a crack in it. I didn't want this mistaken for a heat-of-the-moment blow-up that I might backpedal from later. She reached for my hand then, leaning forward in what I think she meant as a comforting gesture. "You're stressed," she said. "Months of planning. I know you'll see it differently on the day." That was the moment it clicked for me. This wasn't negotiation. This was her trying to hold out the clock, waiting for what she had set in motion to happen. In her mind, whatever I felt now would simply dissolve in the face of the reunion she'd envisioned. She wasn't factoring in that I meant exactly what I just said. I went over it one more time, not to convince her. By then, I knew convincing her wasn't possible, but to make it clear there was no version of this where I suddenly appreciated her choice in the middle of the ceremony. Seeing them won't be a surprise I smile about. It will ruin the day for me. My only regret would be not preventing it. And I need you to understand that if they walk in, I walk out. End of story. She listened the way someone listens to background noise, eyes neutral, mouth in a slight closed lip curve. She wasn't taking in details. She was letting me talk while holding on to her own picture of how this would go. That picture wasn't competing with my actual lived history. It had already replaced it in her mind. By the time I finished, I wasn't even sure she believed me. But I needed to be certain that I had said it plainly and directly, so I said it again. If they show up, I won't. I left it there. One sentence, no extra dressing. That was the truth and the consequence. She nodded once, but not the way you nod when you've actually changed your perspective. It was the nod you give in a conversation you think you'll circle back to later, when you're confident the other person will see things your way. And then, still smiling, she said, "You will see. It's going to be perfect." That was it. There was nothing left to add. She wasn't moving, and I wasn't changing my stance. The only thing I could control now was whether I let her run her version of this without me. So I stood up, told her I was going to get some space, and left. I didn't slam the door or go on a rant. I walked out, drove to my best man's place, and told him everything. He stared at me like I just told him I was starring in a hidden camera prank show and didn't know it. Then he opened a beer, handed it to me, and said, "So, what's your play now?" That night, I lay on his couch with my phone in my hand, not calling her, not calling anyone else. Just thinking through the two doors in front of me, each leading somewhere I didn't want to go. I'd made the boundary clear. Now I had to figure out whether to see what happened if I trusted it to hold or to remove myself entirely before the music ever started. The decision RSVP nope to my own wedding. Once the weight of it settled, there was no avoiding what this had become. I'd been crystal clear more than once that I wouldn't stand at an altar with my parents in the room. That wasn't an idle threat. It was a direct statement of how I would protect myself. Now I was staring down a choice that was stripped of any nuance. Show up and pretend I meant none of it, or stay away and let the wedding implode in front of everyone. There wasn't a middle route, no clever workaround that kept my boundary intact and the ceremony intact too. On paper, those two paths almost looked equal in their damage. If I walked into that venue, smiled for the photos, and tried to dodge every glance from my parents, I might save the spectacle, but at the cost of betraying one of the only rules that's kept me safe for over a decade. That damage would outlast any awkward reception. If I stayed away, I'd take the hit up front, canceled vows, shocked guests, months of planning and money gone in a single morning. But I'd walk away without having folded on the one line in the sand I swore I wouldn't cross. If I was honest with myself, only the second option lined up with the life I've been working towards since I cut contact. The best man didn't have to be persuaded. When I unloaded the whole situation, his first reaction was, "You've got to be kidding me." Then after a beat, "You're not kidding me." We sat there in that moment of disbelief, and it was almost a relief to have someone else confirm just how far past the line this was. When I told him I was still weighing my next move, he didn't soften it. "If you show up, you're telling everyone, including her, that your line in the sand was actually written in chalk." Landed. If I caved here, I wasn't just bending under pressure once, I was showing her that every future boundary could be tested the same way. I went through the logistics in my head, like some cold calculation would make it cleaner. Guests who traveled miles, vendors already paid, deposits gone, photos that would now tell an entirely different story. But under all of that was the fact that my fiancé knew exactly what this would do to me and hid it until it was too late to undo without fallout. It wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate. That alone answered the question of whether I could ever step into a marriage with her after this. There was no value in pretending I could contain the damage if I went along with it. Even if my parents kept to their chairs, even if no heated words were exchanged, I'd still be in that room feeling cornered and betrayed while she watched the scene she'd engineered play out. Every smile from me would be a lie, every moment staged for someone else's idea of closure. That's not a foundation, it's a performance. So the decision stopped feeling like a coin toss and started feeling like the only option left. I wasn't going to spend the first day of a marriage rewriting my own truth to suit worse, and I wasn't going to teach her that overriding me was a survivable move. Once I acknowledged that, the noise in my head began to fade. It wasn't relief, exactly. Deciding to know, show your own wedding is never going to feel good, but certainty has its own kind of calm. I wasn't pacing anymore, or waiting for some last-minute revelation that would make this work. I knew what I was going to do, and that quiet clarity was a better place to stand than dragging it out until the moment I was supposed to say, "I do." I told my best man what I'd landed on, not to get his approval, but to make sure someone else knew before the fact. He didn't argue, just nodded and said, "If my opinion matters, it's the right move." It did matter, even if the responsibility was mine alone. He asked if I was ready for the fallout, the guests, the family, the stories people would tell. I said I was, because the only thing worse than that fallout was standing in front of everyone while the version of love she believed in dismantled the safety I'd built. Thinking about the actual day, I realized it wouldn't need theatrics. There wouldn't be a public showdown or a dramatic walkout. The message would be in my absence. People could speculate. Some would be shocked, others angry, a few maybe relieved, but none of them would see me in that room with the two faces I'd worked so hard to keep out of my life. And that was the point. A quiet, clean refusal, no stage, no scene. Planning it was minimal. I didn't have to explain myself to everyone in advance or make an announcement. I'd simply not go. No suit. No drive to the venue. No entrance down an aisle that now felt like a hallway narrowing to a trap. I'd stay put, let the day unfold without me, and on the other end of it, I'd still have myself intact. The image that stuck with me was the morning itself. Not rushing through a shower, not fumbling with cufflinks, but sitting there fully aware of each passing minute, while an entire event moved forward, somewhere else without its groom. Letting the absence speak more clearly than anything I could say into a microphone. That was what I set my alarm for. Not to get ready, but to make sure I was awake the moment that silence started carrying my answer to everyone gathered in that room. Meanwhile, at the venue of doom. From what I later heard, the venue's morning ran with the kind of predictable rhythm you'd expect. People arranging flowers, fixing place cards, straightening ties, the low hum of chatter and small last-minute adjustments. There was nothing in the air yet to tip anyone off that the day was off script. The ceremony was set for 4 p.m., and when I wasn't visible, no one immediately sounded an alarm. There's always an assumption the groom's off somewhere getting a breather before things kick off. That quiet buffer didn't last long. Around the time small groups began checking in on different pieces of the schedule, someone went to the groom's room, empty. Another figured I might be out in the parking lot. Someone else offered that I was probably taking 15 minutes alone. But as guests began arriving and there was still no sign of me, that polite grace period started to close. Within half an hour, the simple "I'm sure he's nearby" relaxedness shifted into looks between people that said, "Has anyone actually talked to him today?" My best man later described it as the shift you feel when you're at an airport and your flight's quietly delayed. At first, general warmth and expectation. Then frequent glances at the clock, lowered voices, guesses tossed back and forth. By 4:30, the mood had moved from restless to unsettled, and a few people had started drifting outside to look toward the road, scanning for some sign that I was about to pull up. My parents had arrived early enough to get themselves front row seats, and from what I was told, they wasted no time making sure people knew exactly who they were, introducing themselves with an air of entitlement that suggested they were here less as guests and more as a central feature of the day. When the delay began stretching, they didn't stay neutral. First came loud, performative sighs. Remarks about being disrespected and lines about forgetting where you came from, delivered to anyone in earshot. Under the hum of a crowd, those things travel fast. Several people told me later they caught bits of profanity muttered under their breath, always pitched like no one important would hear. The officiant started fielding increasingly pointed questions about the plan. My fiancée was oscillating between smiling tightly for guests and disappearing behind a side door with her maid of honor, emerging each time looking more tense. A number of guests assumed maybe traffic was holding me up. Others whispered in near-conspiratorial tones about cold feet. My best man was getting a steady stream of any word from him, at one point simply switching to a quick shake of the head. Among my relatives who knew the history, I'm told the realization came quickly. They saw my parents planted in the front, understood the one boundary I'd been immovable about, and made the connection without needing extra explanation. They weren't leaning over to speculate. They were just quietly sitting there, bracing for what they already knew must be coming. Meanwhile, my parents' shift from smug to irritated was on full display. They posed as the wrong party, acting personally slighted by the delay, but apparently still convinced I'd appear, ready to collapse into reconciliation on cue. That assumption that they'd get their hugs, their public redemption without having to acknowledge anything they'd done, may be the clearest example yet of why they were never welcome. And from multiple accounts, it only became more self-serving as the absence stretched. One friend said watching them was like watching two people audition the role of most offended guest, trying to center themselves in someone else's event. By about 4:45, the tension was obvious to everyone. Guests were clustered in small groups, voices dropping as certain people passed. The officiant was caught in awkward conversations about contingency plans. My fiancé's presence grew sporadic. And in the middle, my parents stayed fixed in those prime seats with folded arms, radiating irritation. I didn't have to be there to picture their expressions: tight mouths, narrowed eyes, the same look I'd grown up seeing whenever reality failed to adapt to their expectations. There was even a bite of dark humor making the rounds in whispers. A few guests, one told me, were fighting off the urge to laugh, not because they thought a wedding falling apart was funny, but because the composition of it all was absurd. My parents front and center, my fiancé drifting between forced composure and visible panic, and an entire room humming with unspoken guesses. It looked, they said, like the kind of slow-motion disaster you'd expect to see in a reality show you hadn't intended to watch. By the time the clock reached close to an hour past the scheduled start, it was clear without an announcement that the day wasn't going forward. People stopped mid-conversation and looked toward the entrance less and less. No one was expecting a groom to walk in anymore. My best man gave up on politeness and just stopped answering the repeat questions directly. Those with perspective on the situation understood this wasn't a matter of logistics. It was a decision playing out exactly the way I'd warned it would. Eventually, my parents stood, not sheepish or apologetic, but still carrying themselves like the aggrieved party. They left before most of the guests, making a small show of it, enough that one of my friends later said that they walked out like they'd just been insulted at their own banquet. In their exit, even more than their arrival, they managed to turn a day that wasn't about them into another moment that, in their minds, still revolved around them. And in doing so, they gave the clearest possible example to 70 witnesses of exactly why no contact was never negotiable. What remained at the venue was just the slow unraveling. Guests quietly deciding to head home, staff beginning to break down elements of a celebration that would never happen, the space absorbing the kind of stillness that follows a burst of confused energy. My absence had spelled it out long before, but now the physical scene matched the reality. The wedding was over before it began. Hearing it the piece together afterward, I realized the irony. My parents had still managed to create a memorable moment, just not of the kind anyone had pitched. Instead of the swelling music reconciliation fantasy, the legacy of the day was a jumble of awkward silence, scattered theories, and a very public example of what happens when you bulldoze a boundary and expect gratitude in return. And yet, as much as that part played out in plain view, I didn't find out until later that not every piece of this plan had come from one person. There was more than one pair of hands setting the table for what was supposed to happen that day. Unexpected co-conspirator, the future mother-in-law. What I hadn't counted on was that my fiancé hadn't built this plan alone. There was someone else who had been in on it from early on, encouraging her, reinforcing the idea at every step. That person was her mother. For the first couple of days after the called-off wedding, I assumed her family had been as unaware as most of the guests. Our mom and I weren't close, but we'd been consistently polite with each other. We'd exchanged surface-level small talk, made comments on harmless topics, and navigated shared space without awkwardness. She seemed like the type you could get through holidays with by sticking to weather updates and TV shows. That assumption didn't survive my next conversation with my ex-fiancée. She was running through her justifications for the 100th time, and in the middle of it, she let slip that her mom thought it would be the perfect surprise, too. I stopped her and asked directly if that meant her mom had known before the invitations went out. Her answer, of course, she helped, landed harder than I expected. Helped wasn't passive. Help meant that from the beginning, there had been open discussion between them about how to override the one condition I had made immovable. It hadn't been a secret from her mother. In fact, her mother had encouraged it. Her reasoning, according to both of them, was that she didn't want me to have regrets later in life, and she saw this moment as a way to bring the family together. When I spoke to her directly, she framed it exactly that way. She said a wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to heal, to start fresh, and that she thought seeing my parents there would be good for me whether I believed it now or not. She didn't deny knowing I'd made my stance clear. She admitted she'd heard me say plainly, more than once, that my parents were not welcome. But to her, that was something I might get past in the emotion of the day. She said those words calmly, like it was obvious she had my long-term happiness in mind. But all it really showed me was that she was comfortable sidelining my lived experience in favor of her own theory of what I needed. She treated my boundary the same way her daughter had, not as a fixed safeguard, but as an obstacle to be worked around in service of a moment she decided was important. What she never seemed to grasp was that my no contact wasn't rooted in a stubborn disagreement or pride. It was about safety, about preserving what I had built in the years since. I reminded her of what I told her daughter. The stories of my childhood weren't misunderstandings to be cleared up at a photo-ready reunion. They were patterns of behavior that had made any continued contact harmful. She didn't dispute those events, but she brushed past them in favor of her. Conviction that families should be together and that big milestones were the right time to set aside old wounds. Looking back over the months before the wedding, I could suddenly see gaps where the signs had been. Her seemingly offhand remarks about how men sometimes just need a push, or how no one ever regrets having their family there didn't feel so casual in hindsight. The small knowing glances between her and her daughter when the topic of the guest list came up made sense now. Those weren't innocent. They were checkpoints in a plan they were carrying forward together. The alliance between them was what made it unstoppable. If my fiancée had been acting alone, she might have second-guessed herself, hesitated when I reinforced my boundaries in conversation with friends or relatives. But with her mother consistently backing her up, not just quietly approving, but actively reassuring her it was the right thing, they could keep convincing themselves they were orchestrating something noble. They shared that dangerous trait of interpreting control as care, of assuming they could override someone's limits for that person's own good. I don't think her mother believed she was doing harm. I think she truly believed she was adding something valuable to the wedding, to my life. That kind of certainty, when it's wrong, is its own kind of threat, because it erases any reason to stop and question whether you should. She didn't just fail to protect my boundary, she treated dismantling it as a gift. Realizing this wasn't about one person's choice, but a coordinated effort stripped away the last layer of doubt I had about leaving. I hadn't been protecting myself from an isolated lapse in judgment by my fiancé. I'd been protecting myself from a family dynamic where two people could look at my clearest, most repeated request and see it as a challenge to overcome. It reframed everything about what the future would have looked like if I'd gone through with the marriage. It wouldn't have just been me and my partner navigating decisions. It would have been me dealing with an embedded second voice in our relationship, one that had already proven willing to encourage her daughter to ignore me when it mattered most. And the scale of that betrayal wasn't something I could absorb and carry into a long-term commitment. Once I saw the scope of it, staying wasn't an option. Their teamwork had made them more confident, not more cautious. And nothing I could say or do would make them view my boundaries as anything other than temporary walls to be dismantled when they thought the timing was right. By the time I'd pieced all of this together, the shock had faded. All that was left was a kind of cold certainty, knowing exactly why walking away wasn't just justified, it was necessary. Ending the engagement meant removing myself from both the direct betrayal and the dynamic that had supported it. I didn't know at that point that proof of exactly how right this move was already on its way. That would arrive a couple of days later, in the form of a call from a number I hadn't seen in more than a decade. The voicemail that should be in a museum of bad parents. 2 days later, I got a missed call from a number I recognized instantly, even after all these years. There was a voicemail waiting. I sat there looking at the notification, already knowing it wasn't going to be a just checking in kind of message. I didn't press play right away. It felt like holding something I knew might blow up in my hand. When I finally listened, I kept the phone a little away from my ear. Half a second of dead air, and then my father's voice, the same sharp, heavy tone I remembered from being a kid, the one that could make a hello feel like a warning. There was nothing warm in it. The message was exactly what I'd expected, a profanity-laced rant that ran without a pause, as if he'd been rehearsing. He called me names, selfish, ungrateful, a disappointment. He accused me of humiliating the family in front of everyone who matters. He dragged up milestones I'd robbed them of, claimed I'd think differently when we're gone, framed my absence as some unforgivable betrayal. It wasn't just anger, it was mixed with that old familiar entitlement, as though my life's milestones still belonged to them by default. It went on for minutes, cycling through the same material like a bad routine that only the performer thinks is working. His voice shifted at the end into feigned sadness, casting himself as the victim in a story where his adult son had, in his words, thrown his family away for some woman. The irony, of course, was that the some woman he meant was the same one who had invited him there without my knowledge, something lost entirely in his version of events. Then it cut off. No goodbye. No request to call back. Just dead air and the sound of my own breathing in the quiet. Once was more than enough to hear it. The content didn't surprise me. It was the greatest hits of every reason I'd stayed no contact for more than a decade, but it was rare to have it caught so neatly and undeniably in the present tense. I could have left it there, just another entry in a long list of proof points only I would ever hear. Instead, I queued it up for my ex. It wasn't about revenge or scoring points. I wanted her to hear, without my interpretation layered over it, exactly what reconnecting with my parents actually sounded like. We sat across from each other at her kitchen table. I set the phone down between us, hit speaker, and said, "Just listen." No commentary. At first, her expression was neutral, recognition of the voice, maybe, from a passing hello years ago. Then, as the tone and content sank in, her face tightened, forehead creasing, jaw setting, eyes narrowing slightly the way people do when they're trying to reconcile what they're hearing with what they thought was true. By the second minute, she'd leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. She wasn't interrupting, but there was no mistaking the discomfort. She had imagined right up until that morning at the venue that I was overstating the harm, that time and circumstance had exaggerated the distance. Now, she was hearing the unfiltered present-day version directly. When the voicemail ended, there was a long pause. She didn't rush to say anything. She just stared down at the table, then met my eyes again. Something had shifted, and for the first time since this started, there was no counter-argument forming on her lips. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. I didn't know it was like that. There was no spin, no doubling back to talk about regrets or second chances. Just those words landing heavy because they admitted what I'd been telling her all along. She'd built her surprise around a fantasy that didn't exist. For me, the voicemail wasn't news. It was confirmation of what I'd been living with the entire time. But for her, it was the moment the narrative cracked. This wasn't about me being stubborn or about old wounds I refused to forgive. It was about people who still, right now, thought this was an acceptable way to speak to their son and thought they were owed a place in my life regardless. In 3 unbroken minutes, my father had done what I'd failed to do with months of patient explanation. He'd made the case for no contact better than I ever could, just by being himself. No flashbacks, no secondhand accounts, just his own voice proving every boundary I'd drawn was still as necessary as it had been at 18. It was the last time I needed her to agree with me. Whether she did or didn't from here on out didn't change anything. But in that moment, the bridge she'd imagined walking me across had collapsed entirely, and she was standing there seeing the drop for what it was. If anything, the voicemail gave me something I hadn't had before, final clarity that I was done defending my choice, to her or anyone else. She'd heard it herself. Whatever she decided to do with that was hers alone, but I wasn't going to spend 1 more minute trying to persuade. It wasn't relief. It was just stillness. The noise of back and forth arguments and justifications went quiet. Nothing about it made the damage smaller, but it confirmed that I wasn't wrong to keep them out. The idea of folding on that boundary was never about keeping the peace. It would have been walking into the fire with both eyes open. After that, there wasn't anything left hanging between us on this subject. We sat there in silence for another minute, and without it being said, we both knew the conversation had reached its natural end. The only thing left unfinished was what came next in the larger picture. And a few days later, we'd sit down again, not to talk about my parents, but to close the book we'd spent years writing together, without the ending either of us had once pictured. The final meeting, no I do, just we're done. A few days later, we met in a small coffee shop. No tension you could slice with a knife, no big dramatic show, just a quiet corner table in a place where the loudest sounds were spoons against mugs and the steady rhythm of laptops opening and closing. I brought the ring. She had a canvas tote bag and her phone, which she kept glancing at without much urgency. The whole thing felt oddly impersonal, like a brief meeting to close out a file rather than the end of 4 years together. We didn't hug. We didn't touch. I set the ring on the table, pushing it toward her without ceremony. She looked at it for a moment, tilting her head slightly, like she just found something she thought she'd lost. Then she slid it back toward me without a word, her way of quietly confirming that whatever we'd been planning was unrecoverable. I told her plainly this isn't going to work. My tone wasn't sharp, just final. She didn't act surprised, and she didn't try to talk me out of it. For a beat, it seemed like she was about to launch into another explanation, maybe even reach for the old "you'll thank me someday" line, but all that came out was a slow exhale. Neither of us stretched to fill the space with more than was necessary. The end was mutual, even if it wasn't formally labeled that way. We stayed quiet enough that no one nearby would have guessed we were supposed to have been married by now. That was the strange part. Months of preparation, countless conversations about the smallest details, and yet the final talk only needed a few minutes. No raised voices, no scenes. Just two people acknowledging we wouldn't be moving forward and trying to keep it simple. As she idly turned the ring with her fingertips, I could feel she was waiting for me to suggest some kind of softer landing. A let's stay in touch, or maybe we can be friends. But I already knew there was nothing left to preserve. This wasn't slow erosion, it was one breach that took out all the trust we'd built. You can stand things back up after damage if the structure remains, but here there was nothing solid left to work with. Her first full sentence came after a long pause. I didn't think it would end like this. She said it evenly, like describing an outcome that had gone differently than she'd forecasted, not one that cracked her open. I didn't respond directly. The truth was obvious. Of course she hadn't pictured this. She'd been steering toward the moment she wanted, the big reveal she thought would unite everything. But choices have their own gravity, and this was where hers had brought us. From there, we kept it to logistics, returning gifts, canceling the venue, notifying vendors who were still expecting final payments, dividing responsibility for who would contact whom. The conversation was stripped to bullet points, more memo than emotional reckoning. Tomorrow, we'd wake up in different places with a shared series of calls to make, a stack of sunk costs, and no expectation of circling back. The only point where there was a shift in her tone was when she asked, "Did you know you weren't going to show up?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. As soon as I knew they were invited. No defensiveness, no anger, just fact. She didn't push past that, only nodded as if that was the final entry in a list she'd been keeping. Maybe the voicemail from my father had already filled in more blanks than anything I could have explained. Then came the one moment I hadn't anticipated. She said she regretted it, not rushed or mumbled, clear and without distraction. She added that if she could go back, she would have respected my wishes. I didn't meet it with a dramatic speech or a softened bridge. I accepted it for what it was. Maybe it was the truest sentence she'd offered in weeks. But by then, it wasn't enough to alter what happened next. I told her that even if she'd confessed her plan the day she thought of it, nothing would have shifted. It was never about the timing of the reveal. The act itself, crossing the line I had drawn, was the thing that ended us. Whether I'd heard about it 2 months before the wedding or 2 minutes before, the result would have been the same. Some deals can't be renegotiated once they're broken. When the last of the coffee was gone and there was nothing left to delegate or return, we let the silence sit for a moment. I stood first, and she stayed seated, probably choosing to leave at a different time so we wouldn't end up walking out together. That tiny, wordless bit of coordination was the last cooperative act we'd have. By the time I reached my car, I wasn't cycling through relief or heartbreak, just a blunt sense of completion. Everything that could be said had been said. The events that mattered had already happened. What was left was the formal acknowledgement, the last small exchange in a process that had already collapsed at the altar. And as endings go, we didn't need fireworks or tears to mark it. The empty table behind me and the return ring were more than enough. What I didn't recognize until later was how neatly the whole saga, from the first boundary to the last word in that coffee shop, could be lifted and dropped into another format entirely, right down to the cast, the plot twist, and the final quiet scene. Post-mortem, the wedding that became a sitcom pilot. Looking back, the entire sequence could easily be mistaken for a scripted setup. A lineup of characters you couldn't make up. The future mother-in-law who treats boundaries like speed bumps, the bride who's convinced her surprise will change everything, and the groom who's absent, not because of nerves, but because showing up would mean breaking his own word. There's even an opening shot of whispered plans over a wedding binder, and a slow ripple of confusion through a crowd that eventually realizes the ceremony isn't starting, because one of the key people has no intention of walking in. If you framed it as a sitcom pilot, it would probably play for laughs. The misunderstanding would be patched up in 22 minutes, and there'd be a freeze-frame hug before the credits. But real life doesn't work like that. In reality, those scenes don't wrap neatly, because they're not misunderstandings at all. They're breaches of trust. And you can't score that over with upbeat music. The way to keep the damage from happening is to not cross the line in the first place. When I sift through the mess, 3 things stand out. First, boundaries aren't stage props you can pull out for dramatic effect. They're not there to be overridden at a moment you think will look good to the crowd. Second, good intentions don't erase harm. Choosing to betray someone for their own good is still a choice to betray them. Third, respect is the actual foundation of a partnership. Without it, even the most carefully planned events collapse under their own weight. Those aren't abstract ideals. They're practical rules for whether a relationship can survive hard decisions. In this case, every warning light had been flashing. My no wasn't vague. It was repeated, clear, and tied to very specific reasons. Overriding it required not just ignoring my words, but rewriting them in her own head into some softer version where I didn't really mean what I said. Had her mother reassuring her the fantasy ending was more important than what I'd been through, and you've got a built-in approval loop that made it easier for them to keep going right up until the start time on the invitations. That mindset, you'll thank me later, is the part that still sticks. It's the same reasoning people use for everything from unwelcome surprises to outright harmful decisions. They put themselves in the role of the enlightened one, knowing better than you what you need. And when the later they were banking on arrives, and it looks like an empty altar and a room full of guests staring at the aisle, they act as if that too is just a plot twist they can smooth over. For anyone listening who's been through their own version of this, where someone decided their plan mattered more than your boundary, you know the weight of it doesn't just come from the act. It comes from realizing they saw the line, understood it, and stepped over it anyway. It's not about whether the setting was a wedding or a birthday or just a Tuesday night. The scale changes, but the blueprint is the same. Your limit gets reframed as optional the second it conflicts with someone's personal picture of how things should go. That's why intent doesn't get special credit here. If you ignore what someone has told you matters most to them, the fact that you meant well won't build the bridge back. You're not delivering a gift. You're setting a trap and calling it a gesture. And in a relationship, romantic or otherwise, that behavior chips away at the only thing that makes the rest sustainable. On the surface, moments like this can almost look ridiculous from the outside. The idea that one carefully staged scene could magically undo years of distance, repair all harm, and replace lived experience with one instant, it reads like bad comedy. But under that is the quieter, less photogenic truth. If you decide your vision is worth more than someone's safety or peace of mind, you're not acting out of love, you're performing for an audience, even if that audience is just you. And if you're watching this, I want to throw the question to you. Have you ever had your boundary crossed in that same trust me it's for your own good way? It doesn't have to be as big as a wedding. Maybe someone shared personal information you told them to keep private or showed up somewhere you asked them not to be. Drop it in the comments. I'm curious to know if other people have seen how similar the pattern can look across completely different situations. Because when I strip away all the distracting details, the flowers, the seating chart, the soundtrack in her head, it keeps coming back to those same 3 points. Boundaries aren't decorative. Intent doesn't cancel harm. And without respect, none of the other elements matter. You can have the perfect venue, the most carefully chosen playlist, and a photographer whose work belongs in magazines. And it's still just set dressing if the person standing next to you thinks your limits are suggestions. There's a temptation to soften that truth in the name of compromise, but compromise only works when both sides agree on what's at stake. In a situation like this, there was no shared agreement. She and her mother decided the day was the perfect time for their version of a reunion, and I decided my well-being wasn't going to be sacrificed to make it happen. You can't split the difference between those two positions. One side has to yield completely, and I wasn't going to make it mine. Over the months we spent planning, I thought what we were building had respect woven into it. I didn't expect that the first time it was tested, it would fold so completely. The breach wasn't complicated. What I'd asked for was straightforward, and sticking to it would have cost her and her mother nothing they were entitled to in the first place. That's part of what makes it such a clean break. There's no tangle of uncertainty about whether I overreacted or misunderstood. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway. You could package all of that into a scripted show and keep the laugh track running, but there's nothing funny about realizing someone sees your most important lines as temporary obstacles. The comedic beats are easy to spot. The overheard conversation, the front row arrival of people I'd barred from the guest list, the mounting confusion as start time slips by. The lesson, though, doesn't play for laughs. And that lesson is worth holding on to long after this specific event fades from memory. Because the setting will change, swap a wedding for any other high-pressure, high-visibility milestone, and the same dynamic can creep in if you're not careful. Someone will convince themselves they're the exception to your rule, that the significance of the moment justifies erasing your no. It's only when you keep that no intact and live it out that you find out what's left on the other side. That's what this all circles back to. Protecting the space you've made for yourself, especially when it's hard, especially when it would be easier in the short term to cave. Whether you do it quietly or in front of a room full of people, the value is the same. You're showing yourself that your boundaries hold, and that they mean as much on the so-called biggest days as they do on the small ones. And that matters, because sometimes the scale of the day is exactly what makes people think it's okay to rewrite the rules. But when you fought for safety, for peace of mind, those things aren't chips to be cashed in for a moment on someone else's terms. They're the reason you stand where you are at all. And that leads directly into what I realized once the dust settled. 12. Conclusion. A wedding doesn't wipe out history or turn harm into something harmless. No amount of pageantry changes the fact that respect for boundaries is the real measure of a relationship's strength. In the end, the clearest gift I could give myself was choosing not to trade my safety or peace of mind for someone else's version of the perfect day. That decision wasn't about winning or proving a point. It was about keeping what I'd fought hard to build. If you've ever had a surprise backfire this badly, share it in the comments. And if you like honest, messy relationship stories told with a little humor, stick around for more.